All right, guys, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the first bodybuilders, so to speak, famous actor type bodybuilder guys. That's Steve Reeves. You can trace bodybuilding back a long, long way. I mean, all the way back to Eugene Sandow in the 1800s. Who had a pretty decent physique for back then, with no knowledge really of diet. No supplements, no drugs, anything like that. And obviously the Mr. Olympia trophy is named after Sandow. But Steve Reeves was kind of the first Mr. Hollywood bodybuilder type. He was actually at one time, I don't know if this pic is real. I suppose it is doing the vacuum there. It looks like he's nude. But Reeves is kind of a controversial guy because he claimed to never use drugs. And this was a long, long time ago. I mean, back in the 60s and the 50s. So were drugs around? They were around. Drugs were around back then. Make no mistake about it. So to think maybe that Steve Reeves was natural, I don't know. I'd be surprised, to be honest with you. I mean, you can kind of tell. Yeah, you can have pretty good genetics for legs, but you can kind of see his legs and calves, and I mean his arms were, back in the day. This is a pretty outstanding physique. I mean, definitely this guy would be a freak back in the day in the 50s and 60s, obviously. But was he drug free? That's a big question. I don't know. I would probably say not. I'd have, I'd have to say I think Diana Ball was around, and Test was around back then too. So uh, I'm not sure about Deca, but regardless, I mean, I'm sure he didn't take massive amounts. I mean, obviously compared to today's guys, but I had a pretty outstanding physique. One of the first real, like I said, Hollywood type muscular guys. Made a name for himself. At one time, here's Sandow. You can kind of compare physiques. So that kind of shows you the progression of the human body. Like this is Sandow. Uh, you know, I mean, for back then, he was a freak too, but this would be like an average physique, and not average, but a physique you see in the gym nowadays from a natural bodybuilder. So you can kind of see this is. I'm sure he was probably natural. Sandow versus Steve Reeves physique. I mean, there's quite a difference. Now back then, bodybuilding wasn't mainstream, so you had guys walking around with amazing genetics that never even heard of bodybuilding or cared about bodybuilding probably. So you could go as far as to say that Reeves was just a guy with awesome genetics who did capitalize on that. One of the first guys. Well, you can make that assumption. Reeves was, like I said, he was actually a pretty famous actor. In fact, I think he was the highest paid actor in Europe at one point, and I think he was in Hercules, like one of the first Hercules, and it was actually one of the biggest movies of the year. I think about $5 million gross. He actually had turned down the role, Steve Reeves, of James Bond in Doctor No, believe it or not, because his salary was not high enough for him. He also turned down the role that finally went to Clint Eastwood in A Fistful of Dollars because he could not believe that Italians could make a Western. So I don't know. That sounds like he was a little. But back then that wasn't a big deal. People had attitudes like that, so it wasn't politically correct a lot of times. But people didn't really care back then. But Reeves had a pretty outstanding physique. There are articles about Steve Reeves. This is evolutionary.org. You take it for what it is. I mean, uh, the question is, to these guys, it was pretty obvious Reeves did use steroids, but he also had awesome genetics. I mean, he most definitely did. And they're talking again about the highest grossing movie, Hercules, 4.7 million US dollars at that point. And they're just speculating on what he might have taken. D-ball was around. Some light testosterone. I'm not sure about DECA, but and here's another article too. Now they're showing Sandow again right here, and they're actually talking about Sandow, and he wasn't even natural. The rumor is now with Eugene Sandow, he was actually taking amphetamines because amphetamines were definitely around to actually looked drier and more ripped during his show uh, and presentation for that day because people would kind of flock to see him in displays of strength and, of course, his body. But he was just, I mean, he was just a real cut guy with, decent musculature for back in the day. Back then, this is pretty freaky physique. But you know, certainly by today's standards, it pales in comparison. But Sandow was probably natural. I mean, obviously he was, except for what they're saying, amphetamines. And they're also talking about Steve Reeves here. How Steve Reeves definitely was not a natural bodybuilder. He did experiment with low doses of steroids. And back then, it probably was, who knew what a high dose was, really, to be honest. Uh, you know, so things haven't changed a whole lot. People still do whatever it takes, they did back then, and they completely will, do those kinds of things up until the end of time. So as long as the drugs are available. So yeah, I mean, test was made. I mean, most you probably know, some don't. 1935. So I mean, it's been around a long, long time. Um, and believe me, these guys in Hollywood probably knew about it. So Steve Reeves definitely knew about it. John Grimmick probably knew about it. Uh, they talk. You can read about this. I mean, a lot of guys are going to say you're crazy, man. Steve Reeves is not any kind of testosterone, whatever it is, but he probably was. I mean, let's be honest. Reeves died of a blood clot, actually, after surgery. He died in California. So died at the age of 74. So he lived a long, long time. Died in 2000. Again, Steve Reeves, pretty awesome physique. I mean, this was, you see this guy back then, it would have been quite a sight. But this was when bodybuilding started to take off. There were some big dudes around, but Steve Reeves was kind of the most famous, certainly one of the most famous actor bodybuilders to ever live.